This committee will come to order. With no objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Welcome to today's hearing entitled An Overview of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Budget Proposal for Fiscal Year 2024. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning and welcome to our hearing on NOAA's budget proposal for fiscal year of 2024. I'd like to welcome the Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere, or more simply known as the NOAA Administrator, Dr. Rick Spinrad, as our sole witness this morning to discuss the President's proposed budget for the agency. Economically, we are in unprecedented time. Everyone might be tired of hearing that word, having been used countless times during COVID, but there is no other way to describe the state of our economy right now. Federal spending is at a record high, while inflation is nowhere near the Fed's 2% target, and prices continue to rise for American families. We are also rapidly approaching the debt limit and the possibility of the federal government defaulting on its debts. All of that to say, any talks around the budget and spending, even at an agency like NOAA, warrant careful consideration and calculated decisions. The President has requested $6.8 billion for NOAA's budget in FY24, the most in NOAA's history. This request would be a $407 million increase from the discretionary and mandatory money that NOAA was appropriated last year and a $1.3 billion increase from FY22. It's also worth noting that NOAA received an additional $2.7 billion from the infrastructure law that remains available until 2027. NOAA also received one-time influxes of $3.3 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act and over $500 million in the FY23 Disaster Supplemental Bill. So with some quick back-of-the-napkin math, we can see that NOAA has an additional $8 billion that they didn't have just 2 years ago and likely didn't prepare for. That is a staggering number and primed for waste, fraud, and abuse without proper oversight. As I have already mentioned, our current economic outlook clearly tells us that federal spending isn't sustainable. I'm not placing the blame on NOAA, nor am I advocating for drastic cuts at the agency. I'm simply opening an honest and upfront dialogue about what is critically necessary and what is a luxury within our country. We can't act like NOAA's coffers are dry. We need to shift from the give me more mindset to maximize what we've been given. As the budget request accurately describes, NOAA provides the environmental science, information, and services needed to protect lives, lifestyles, and livelihoods for every single American. Therefore, when making any budget decision, we should be asking, does this program, activity, or funding protect lives and property? I'm pleased to see manageable increases to NOAA's Oceanic and Atmospheric Research and the National Weather Service. These two offices are at the forefront of innovation and prediction that can indeed save lives. On the other hand, I'm perplexed to see a decrease in the funding for National Mesonet Program and a long-term plan to flat fund commercial data purchases in the future. These two programs are golden examples of how NOAA can supplement and even improve their weather data inventory with cheaper, flexible industry efforts. If we're looking to save taxpayer money, it seems logical to bolster these programs rather than have NOAA try to collect data on their own through expensive build-outs and federally owned instruments. Nonetheless, I remain optimistic about NOAA's future. I have no doubt Administrator Spinrad had tough conversations of his own in developing this budget, without question. I'm confident we can talk civilly through any differences in opinion we have and work together to best advance NOAA's mission. I look forward to hearing from Administrator Spinrad today and in the future as we look together to support NOAA's life-saving activities. I now recognize the ranking member of the Environment Subcommittee, the gentlewoman from North Carolina, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Miller, and we're celebrating because we got a bill through the House this week, doing a lot of work together. But thank you for holding this important hearing on NOAA's fiscal year 2024 budget request. And thank you to Administrator Spinrad for joining us this morning to discuss NOAA's plans for this upcoming year. NOAA is at the forefront of weather and climate prediction, research, fisheries management, coastal resilience, environmental stewardship, economic development, and so much more. By executing its mission, NOAA is playing a critical role in protecting the health and well-being of people and the environment in the United States. And it has been doing this for decades. Without a doubt, it's paramount for Congress to continue supporting NOAA's mission through a well-funded budget. I was excited to see the focus of NOAA's fiscal year 2024 budget is building a climate-ready nation. As we're all aware, climate change is progressing at breakneck speed, with some impacts being seen far sooner than models have predicted. Severe weather events, including drought, flooding, coastal erosion, and superstorms, are becoming more common, and their destructive power is increasing. Climate change threatens our food system by affecting the productivity of agriculture and fisheries. The importance and timeliness of NOAA's focus on building a climate-ready nation cannot be understated. With more than $450 million increase in discretionary appropriations from the fiscal year 2023 enacted budget, NOAA is poised to shore up its efforts in key areas critical to the interests of all Americans. I'd like to highlight a few here. Building on the investments made in the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law, NOAA's requested funding will support an Earth system approach to climate products and services, advance precipitation predictions across weather and climate timescales, and support a whole-of-government effort to address the climate crisis. North Carolina's 2nd Congressional District, which I represent, is home to NC State University and close to other major research universities on the forefront of addressing the climate crisis in the United States and beyond. Partnerships between academic institutions and NOAA and access to competitive grants for research rely on the agency receiving a robust and reliable funding system. Beyond these grants and partnerships, agriculture and fisheries are major contributors to my state's economy. We must ensure NOAA has the support it needs to provide the science necessary to effectively manage our food, resources, and economy. However, NOAA's fiscal year 2024 plans for improving its life-saving products, services, and other capabilities are at risk. I'm very concerned about the proposed budget cut led by Speaker McCarthy that passed the House. Cutting NOAA's budget by at least 22% below fiscal year 2023 enacted levels will be devastating for the progress that NOAA is making to increase forecast accuracy and support communities becoming climate resilient. I hope all members of this committee can agree on the importance of NOAA's mission and work together to support this critical work on behalf of our districts. I look forward to hearing from Administrator Spinrad today about NOAA's plans for fiscal year 2024 and how Congress can support you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Ross. I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Oklahoma, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Miller, and I want to extend my warmest welcome to Administrator Spinrad. It's good to see you again. When you were in front of this committee for the first time as administrator, I told everyone there's a picture of you in Oklahoma at the dedication of the National Weather Center in 2006. Since the Weather Center received $9.5 million last year for an expansion project, which we can discuss more today, I hope to see you in Norman, Oklahoma very soon for a similar celebration and another picture. While we're only 5 months into this Congress, today's hearing is already our 3rd involving NOAA-related activities. That goes to show how much this committee and I personally value and appreciate NOAA's role in the federal research ecosystem. While the previous 2 hearings have focused on the committee's future legislative efforts, a NOAA Organic Act, and reauthorizing the Weather Act, I hope that today's hearing will focus more on current activities and the appropriate funding levels for certain programs. Before we move forward with any legislative changes, we need to understand what's already happening, examining what's working and what isn't. When it comes to the President's budget request, I've said many times over many years that this is just that, a request. Congress controls the purse, and you're here to make the case for your vision of NOAA. We'll see where we agree and where we need to work out some differences, but I promise you, we'll get there. NOAA is requesting $6.8 billion for a broad array of activities ranging from weather forecasting and climate prediction to ocean and atmospheric observations. While I don't doubt the need for these activities, I personally advocated for requiring some of them. I acknowledge that. It's important to put it into context. This would be an annual budget of $1.4 billion more than what NOAA was operating with just 5 years ago. That's a quick growth for any agency, especially for one that at times has struggled with workforce recruitment and retention. So while I respect many of NOAA's goals and understand that funding is required to achieve them, we must recognize we are in a time of tough but important conversations. We can't assume an endless increasing budget and must be aware of that fact, that to be accountable to taxpayers, even funding increases come with caveats and reforms. At the end of the day, all of the activities under NOAA's budget request should have one fundamental end goal: protecting lives and property. Anything else is window dressing. I look forward to working with the administrator to advance this goal in the best possible ways. And with that, thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Lucas. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentlewoman from California, for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Miller and Ranking Member Ross, for this important hearing. And welcome back, Doctor. Thank you for your service and your leadership at NOAA. I'm looking forward to today's discussion on NOAA's priorities in the upcoming year. I think NOAA is just a critically important scientific agency, and we all know it has a direct effect on the livelihoods of all Americans. Tasked with helping our communities, economy, and ecosystems remain healthy and resilient, we have to recognize that in the face of growing climate change threats, NOAA provides absolutely critical research products and services necessary to us. I think the budget request is a positive step, but as the ranking member of the subcommittee has mentioned, in the proposed 22% budget cut that passed the House a couple of weeks ago, I think that would be a pretty catastrophic impact on NOAA, and I'd love to have your thoughts on that when it comes to your testimony. I'm eager to learn from you, Administrator, about how the proposed cuts would affect NOAA and your services. We've learned that one of the primary reasons we lag our international counterparts in severe weather forecasting is due to NOAA's lack of access to high-performance computing, as well as its investment in data assimilation, which is a step behind. And as we've seen with ever more severe weather events, including, I'll mention this winter's just devastating flooding and loss of life in California due to atmospheric rivers, the forecasts and warnings are needed now more than ever. I believe that the President's budget request contains a number of programs and activities to expand NOAA's capabilities and increase the resiliencies of communities. And one of the important investments for the future of NOAA is the observational capabilities that would result from the next generation of weather satellites. Now, the data collected by NOAA's weather satellites really make up the backbone of NOAA's weather prediction capabilities. And although you're working diligently to update the National Civilian Weather Satellite System to increase capabilities and the continuity of accuracy, we really need to support those efforts as is outlined in the President's budget. As we look ahead to the future of NOAA, I look forward to working with Chairman Lucas and our colleagues on both sides of the aisle as we sort through the various issues relative to NOAA and the Chairman's idea about restructuring, which we will work on in good faith. I would just note that, sometimes it's easy to focus on the cost and neglect to understand the value. And here's a case where with our atmospheric rivers threatening agriculture, the fire devastation that's occurred not only in California but throughout the West, we need accurate forecasting, both to pre-deploy resources for predicted devastating fires, to help our farmers prepare for devastating flooding and many other things. So I look forward to hearing from you how the President's proposed budget would help us better protect Americans who need your predictions to be accurate, timely, and again, thank you for appearing here, Doctor. I look forward to your testimony, and I would yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Lofgren. I now want to recognize the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, to introduce our witness today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to introduce Dr. Rick Spinrad, Administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and an Oregonian. Dr. Spinrad is a champion of science, ocean health, and natural resources with a distinguished career. Spanning more than 4 decades, he has made significant contributions to the field of oceanography and dedicated his life to the advancement of scientific knowledge and the protection of the planet's precious resources. As an alum of Oregon State University, Dr. Spinrad understands and deeply appreciates the natural beauty and economic importance of the country's coastal regions. His lifelong work as an oceanographer reflects his expertise in this area and his dedication to its preservation and protection. Before his appointment as NOAA Administrator, Dr. Spinrad held a number of important positions in the field of oceanography. He served as Chief Scientist of NOAA's National Ocean Service and the Assistant Administrator for Oceanic and Atmospheric Research. He was also the Vice President for Research at Oregon State University, where he oversaw research programs in a wide range of scientific disciplines. Dr. Spinrad has served as a member of numerous scientific advisory committees, including the Joint Ocean Commission Initiative and the National Science Foundation's Advisory Committee for Geosciences. As administrator, Dr. Spinrad has been instrumental in developing and implementing key policies and programs that support NOAA's mission to understand and predict changes in climate, weather, oceans, and coasts. Additionally, his expertise is vital to implementing important investments from the FY24 budget request in research and development, coastal resilience, and climate adaptation. We're fortunate to have such a distinguished and accomplished individual leading NOAA, and I am confident that under his leadership, the nation's natural resources are in good hands. Please join me in welcoming NOAA Administrator Dr. Rick Spinrad, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. I now recognize Administrator Spinrad for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Chair Miller, Ranking Member Ross, Chair Lucas, and Ranking Member Lofgren, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the President's fiscal year 2024 budget request for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. And Congresswoman Bonamici, thank you for that very kind introduction. For fiscal year 2024, NOAA proposes a budget of $6.8 billion in discretionary appropriations, an increase of $450.5 million from the FY23 enacted. The FY24 budget builds on investments in the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law for climate-ready coasts, climate data and services, and fisheries and protected resources. This combination of funding will empower us to address a growing demand for climate information, services, and products that are needed to build a climate-ready nation. This budget supports NOAA's goal of scaling up critical efforts to understand and mitigate impacts of the climate crisis. Specifically, NOAA will make investments in research, observations, and forecasting, restoration and resilience, offshore wind development, and equity both within the agency and around the nation. It also includes additional investments in our fleet and aircraft, satellites and space weather observations, and predictions to ensure NOAA continues to provide actionable environmental intelligence that is the basis for smart policy and decision-making in a changing world. Communities around the country, rural and urban, are struggling with the effects of high-impact weather, climate, and water events like hurricanes, floods, droughts, wildfires, and fisheries collapse. Our partners, including other federal agencies, emergency managers, and underserved and vulnerable communities, rely on NOAA's weather and climate data, tools, and services to gain insights in order to take decisive action. Therefore, NOAA's FY24 request will make significant investments to optimize the National Weather Service Integrated Dissemination Program, improve precipitation forecasts using NOAA's Unified Forecast System, and expand our service delivery through the capabilities of the Climate Adaptation Partnerships Program, among other things. As our weather and climate become increasingly complex, NOAA's satellite observations, data, and scientific experts are needed now more than ever. In FY24, NOAA will invest in the next generation of satellites, which will allow us to better observe environmental phenomena so that we can expand our service delivery to meet the evolving needs of the American public. In FY24, NOAA will continue to optimize advances in science and technology to create value-added, data-driven, sustainable economic development with a particular focus on the new blue economy. Our request supports the expansion of offshore wind energy, ocean and coastal mapping and charting, and development of key information systems in our tsunami, weather, and space infrastructure. To that end, NOAA will continue to work closely with the Department of the Interior's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to minimize the effects of offshore energy projects on protected marine resources, fisheries, and important habitats, as well as mitigate impacts to our fisheries surveys. Additionally, FY24 funding will support improvement in the safety of commercial space activities as Earth's orbits become increasingly congested with space traffic and debris. Our request will allow the Office of Space Commerce to continue toward meeting its goal of achieving full operating capability for space situational awareness services. NOAA continues to prioritize equity in every facet of our mission delivery, including how we co-develop and provide products and services to every community. NOAA is working internally to create a model agency that draws from the full diversity of the nation, where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. In FY24, NOAA will expand the use of social, economic, and climate change metrics that uniquely characterize a community's vulnerability and resilience to disturbances. This will, in turn, enable users to implement policies that address environmental, climate, and racial equity and justice considerations. People know that they can turn to NOAA for reliable climate and weather information to help make informed decisions that help save lives and livelihoods. With increased funding in FY24, NOAA will ensure continuity from legacy systems while providing significant improvements in data and products and continue investments aligned with our strategic vision. I look forward to working closely with you all and to discussing NOAA's mission more with you today. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Administrator Spinrad, in December of 2022, NOAA began its work on its next generation geostationary extended observations, known as GeoXO, satellite program. This is NOAA's largest procurement ever. Issues with this previous NOAA weather satellite procurement, such as the Geostationary Operational Environmental Satellite R-Series and the Joint Polar Satellite System, earned listing on GAO's high-risk series. Due to significant schedule delays that threatened gaps in weather monitoring, degraded capabilities from what was originally promised, and outrageous cost overruns. GOES-R went from a projection of under $7 billion to costing over $11 billion. JPSS, when originally conceived as the National Polar Orbiting Operational Environmental Satellite Systems, was estimated to cost $6.5 billion, but eventually was scrapped in place of JPSS, which ballooned to nearly $13 billion, not accounting for $4 billion sunk into NPOESS. Very simply, what specifically is NOAA doing to ensure history is not repeated on GeoXO? And I'd like concrete steps and procedures, not broad goals.
Thank you, Chair Miller. And I'd start by saying that obviously this element of our observational infrastructure is one of the critical components in our being able to produce even better forecasts, observations for the breadth of phenomena that were alluded to in the opening statements, from hurricanes to atmospheric rivers to even some of the fisheries issues that we deal with. So having a sustained, reliable, well-managed satellite constellation activity is critical for NOAA. To that end, one of the things that I have undertaken in my role as administrator is to build what I would call a rigorous acquisition strategy and structure into our satellite program, which involves a requirements-based approach, very specific definition of risk register elements and mitigation aspects for that risk register, as well as milestone gates for each step in the acquisition process. Consequently, The budget that we've developed goes out several years, builds on lessons learned and capabilities we have right now, and also has risk mitigation elements in terms of technology insertion. So that alludes to the fact that it takes several years to design, build, and ultimately launch these satellites. We know technology changes in that period. Can we design in a way that we can incorporate in sort of a spiral development context the new technologies to make sure that by the time we launch, say in the early 2030s, we're using the best, highest, and most reliable technology available to improve our forecast capabilities? Thank you.
Do you feel confident in your approach in terms of mitigating those costs in the future? As I know that technology evolves over years, as you had stated, and costs increase, which we are very aware of, especially now in today's economy. But you yourself, are you confident that we can treat taxpayer money responsibly and use it efficiently regarding these programs and not have them balloon like some of the others that I just referenced?
Thank you, Chair Miller. I feel very confident, largely because I have a lot of confidence in our own technology and our own technical expertise, but we also work very closely with our partners. So we work very closely with NASA on the initial design and construction and launch, obviously, of these satellites. And we also have ongoing dialogue with our, I would say, partners around the world, the European Meteorological Satellite Service, for example, the Japanese Satellite Service. Not so much relying on them, but learning lessons with respect to technology from our partners. And obviously, we rely heavily on our defense sector and the methods and technologies that they are developing as well.
Thank you. I'll try to squeeze this last one in. Administrator Spinrad, my district, Ohio 7, touches the southern part of Lake Erie and contains the Cuyahoga River. In 2022, and for the first time in 30 years, NOAA sent one of its white ships to the Great Lakes with the explicit goal of mapping. While I appreciate last year's efforts and hope NOAA will continue to send its ships to the Great Lakes, the stark reality is that currently only 7% of the Great Lakes have been mapped. This leaves a tremendous amount of information on the table that could help us environmentally and economically. With NOAA having a set goal of mapping the entire U.S. exclusive economic zone by 2040, and with NOAA mapping activities being flat funded in your proposed budget, will NOAA be able to realistically meet this mapping trajectory? And is this a task that you can carry out on your own and only with crewed assets?
So thank you for that question. I'm personally especially noting the work done in the Great Lakes because my own aide actually came off the Thomas Jefferson and actually conducted some of that survey work. So I've got a personal guide associated with the work that needs to be done. Mapping and charting of the Great Lakes and coastal waters is a critical issue. We are behind the curve in terms of being able to get to the full objectives that have been stipulated for many years. So what do we do about it? Well, one of the first things is establish through a strategic design what are the priorities, how to get to those goals. So the National Ocean Mapping, Exploration, and Characterization, which includes the Great Lakes, gives us a pathway towards reaching the kinds of goals you alluded to. But also we're looking aggressively at how to work with our private sector partners to make sure that we can complement our government capabilities with those industry capabilities to get to the goals that you've alluded to.
Thank you, Dr. Spinrad. I now recognize Ranking Member Ross for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Severe weather is not new to North Carolina. Constituents in my district and across the state have been hit by hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, ice, and snowstorms. NOAA's Office of Marine Aviation Operations manages and operates NOAA's specialized ships and aircraft that are responsible for a range of critical research and collecting environmental data. This includes the P-3 aircraft that fly into tropical cyclones, collecting essential data that improves the intensity and tracks of hurricane forecasts by 10 to 15% and 15 to 20%, respectively. The two nearly 50-year-old P-3 aircraft will reach their end of life in 2030. The intended replacement aircraft, the C-130s, will take at least 6 years to become operational. While the proposed budget ensures the P-3 aircraft will remain operational through 2030, I'm concerned with the lack of detail on the plan to replace those aircraft and acquire the new C-130s that were highlighted as a priority. As you're aware, your weather research missions are increasingly put at risk if the acquisition plan is not on schedule. What's your plan to ensure that there's no gap in the data that the P-3 planes collect?
Thank you, Ranking Member Ross, for raising this very important issue. I'll start by saying that you will see no compromise in our mission capability in the years to come, especially tied to hurricane reconnaissance and forecast. As you indicated, we're planning for the replacement of the two P-3s with up to 4 aircraft. That's part of an aircraft recapitalization plan that took several years to develop, is well thought out and well justified. We've already started down that path through the resources provided in the supplemental appropriation. We have begun contracts for purchase of the first of those C-130 replacements, and the intent, as funds are available, is to include options on that contract for 3 additional aircraft.
And how would any budget cuts affect that?
Budget cuts, obviously, no part of our mission is optional, and budget cuts would undoubtedly delay, or dare I say, depending on the specific guidance we get with respect to cuts, actually defer that kind of acquisition. And the main point then is we will lose that, as you indicated, anywhere from 15 to 30% improvement in our capability to forecast those storms. But I also want to point out that we have another aircraft. So when we talk about the Hurricane Hunters, we also have a high altitude aircraft, a Gulfstream 550 right now that we use, and we've got resources through the Inflation Reduction Act to purchase an additional high altitude aircraft, and we have started that contract negotiation as well. So we're well on the way in terms of contracts and acquisitions to have 2 aircraft under construction for purchase by NOAA this year.
Great. Next question. The important work being done across NOAA cannot be done without its workforce, and I represent some of the workforce. I want to highlight specifically the National Weather Service in the Raleigh office and the work they do in providing severe weather and climate forecasts and warnings that help protect lives, property, and more of constituents in my district and in the surrounding areas. Having a robust and diverse workforce is critical for NOAA to effectively carry out its mission. However, being competitive with the private sector, recruiting diverse experts, and strict work policies seem to be challenges that NOAA faces in recruiting and retaining people. Can you expand on NOAA's effort to recruit and retain its workforce, as well as your DEI efforts?
Yes, thank you for that. I couldn't be prouder of our workforce, so I love being able to talk about our ability to recruit and retain. We have, I would argue, one of the most dedicated and highly professional workforces in the federal government. The challenges of bringing people in, especially as we come out of COVID and try to ensure that we are meeting our mission, but also attending to the work-life balance requirements that people have, has required us to put policies in place to make sure that we can accommodate people's needs and provide real opportunities. I would start by saying it's our mission that attracts most people into NOAA. A lot of folks are excited about working on improvements to weather forecasting, fisheries management, tsunami warnings, everything we do. We are exploiting, I should say, heavily using a number of tools like direct hire authority. So that allows us to use some of our fellowship and internship programs to bring people on in a much more accelerated fashion. I've also redoubled our efforts through our Human Capital Services Office to make sure that we can aggressively work through the federal hiring process. We are already more than halfway through this fiscal year, and we are more than halfway through our goal of hires for this year. Diversity, equity, inclusion is of primary importance with respect to what our workforce looks like. We have some work to do in that regard, and I'm delighted that we've established a program of employee resource groups as well as initiatives to work with the educational community through historically black colleges and universities and minority serving institutions to help build that, if you will, that workforce that then can apply to our jobs.
Thank you very much. I see my time's expired, but it goes without saying that if you have a 22% budget cut, it will affect hiring. Is that correct?
Again, I think depending on what constraints and what guidance we're provided with, we would undoubtedly be faced with reductions in force with a cut of that magnitude.
Thank you, and I yield back.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Ross. The chair now recognizes Mr. Posey from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Spinrad, could you clarify how NOAA is working with all stakeholders, including the recreational and commercial fishermen, concerning its proposed rules to establish vessel speed measures to protect whales?
Yes, thank you for that question, Congressman Posey. So the proposed rulemaking that you've alluded to is following the procedures associated with rulemaking that are dictated to us. So
Okay. Any reason why the Marine Manufacturers Association told me they were not consulted before the rule was published?
Actually, I believe the National Marine Manufacturers Association did provide a comment during the public comment period.
But before it was published?
Well, the public comment period opens up after the proposed rulemaking.
So there's no consulting before about the rule at all?
The process is one where we
Okay.
open up the public comment period.
Could you
after
tell
that.
me what specific statutory authority NOAA has to justify their proposed rules?
This is done under the context of the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act.
What specific statutory authority to set speed limits in the ocean?
I'm going to have to get back to you with respect to which specific part of the statute is the relevant one, but it is under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And
Well,
Endangered Species.
I would really like to know what specific authority that Congress said, we want you to set speed limits in the ocean.
Yeah, I want to be careful that I make correct reference to the component of MMPA and ESCA, so I'll have to get back to you with that specific answer.
Okay. Have you completed a cost-benefit analysis of that rule?
Yes, we did do a cost-benefit.
Okay. Would you send me a copy of that?
We can certainly do that.
Mr. Chairman, I want to ask for unanimous consent to include, for the record, a congressional delegation letter to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration concerning the proposed rule.
Without objection.
Thank you. Just out of curiosity, how many whales have been killed by boats? Do you have any idea?
All whales?
Let's say the rice and right whales.
The North Atlantic right whales, which are the ones that are under consideration right now in the rulemaking, the number is, and I'll give you an approximate number, of about 13 in the last 15 years.
Okay. I mean, is that kind of compare with the windmill dying of the whales in the Northeast?
There is no scientific evidence that any of the activity associated with the offshore wind development has had an impact on the health of the whales.
Okay. Does NOAA plan to control costs by developing the geostationary extended observation sounder instrument at the same time as the Japanese sounder?
We obviously are working very closely with our Japanese colleagues. In fact, next week I'll be meeting with the director of the Japanese Meteorological Agency and the director of the Japanese Space Agency. And in the acquisition for the sounder and imager, we have coordinated closely with Japanese and made sure that our plans with respect to acquisition are understood by them. So the answer is yes, we are coordinating closely with our Japanese colleagues.
Okay, any chance that could be delayed? Sounder could be delayed?
That our acquisition of the sounder, or our, I want to make sure I understand
The award.
Well, at this point, we're on track for the award.
Okay. Any idea how we could avoid any delays in it, or?
Yeah, I think, well, the sounder acquisition is underway. The imager acquisition, as I recall, is scheduled for August for announcement. And the way to make sure we stay on that is to use the rigorous acquisition cycle and milestone approach that we have been using thus far.
And we're on course. At the
And we are
present
on
time.
course, yes, sir.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. The chair now recognizes Ms. Lofgren for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I discussed in my opening statement, the situation with flooding in California is pretty severe, and actually probably going to get worse when the snow pack in the Sierra melts in the Central Valley. But in my own district of the 18th district, we had just catastrophic flooding in Pajaro. The levees broke, hundreds of people were displaced. Along the Salinas River, levees were overbreached, fields were inundated. San Ardo was flooded. That was in January, and then again in March. And these were described as atmospheric river events. So I'm concerned, and maybe you can reassure me, that it looks like the NOAA budget proposal looks to reduce the atmospheric river observations. That would be a concern. Can you explain that to me? Where are we going to be on that observation, critical observation?
Yeah, I assure you, it's very much front and center in our minds to improve our capability for atmospheric river forecasts, and there are various components of that, most of which are actually seeing increases in budget requests. And so I would point out that the very early research on atmospheric rivers was done by a NOAA researcher, Marty Ralph, who's now at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and I took the opportunity to get briefed by Marty just a few months ago to find out exactly what his intent was to do with our colleagues in Boulder. So there is a small increase for investment in atmospheric river research. I would also point out that part of the capability for the forecast is our detection capability. So the geostationary satellite investments are intended to ensure we continue to have observational capabilities. I alluded to the improvements in our high-altitude aircraft. The Gulfstream 550 is another critical observational capability. And then the last thing I would point out is a large chunk of the bipartisan infrastructure law funding is tied to flooding forecast capabilities and addressing some of the precipitation frequency forecasts through build-out of what we call the Atlas 15, the precipitation atlas. So there are a number of different steps that we're undertaking, both in research and operations, to ensure improved capability.
Thank you very much. That's very reassuring. I know you've discussed the impact of budget reductions. I'd ask that you, if your budget were cut 22%, could you describe, not here, but later, give us an outline of what are the various alternatives that you would look at to do a 22% reduction in your budget? And if we could get that after the hearing, I would very much appreciate it. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Lofgren. The chair now recognizes myself for 5 minutes. Administrator, NOAA has proposed a rule to broaden or add boats over 35 feet to the current 10-knot rule. It's currently imposed on boats over 65 foot and in specific areas for those boats over 65 foot. So not only does it drop the boat length down from 65 to 35, but it's also going to expand the zone to basically the entire East Coast, and as far out as 100 miles, and that's going to be up to 7 months a year. My question is, can you tell the committee just how many registered vessels there are between 35 and 65 feet long?
I can't give you an exact number. We can certainly come back to that. I can tell you that of the recreational boats, only about 3 to 4% of them are larger than 35 feet.
My numbers are upwards of well over 10,000 that I've been able to find just so far since you and I recently talked. You just stated that you approximately think there may be 13 to 15 out of 15 years of these wells that have been hit. From what I've read, we've had 24 strikes in 24 years across 10 states. Out of that, 8 were attributed to boats between 35 and 65 feet. You know what those odds are? That's 1 in a million. In light of that, how do you justify this rule?
I would point out that of those 8 strikes you alluded to, 6 were actually fatal as well. And I would say the justification for the rule comes from our obligation to follow the law of the Marine Mammal Protection Act.
That's 1 in a million odds to hit that, to hit a right whale with a boat that size. As a matter of fact, the strike zone that I think you have is somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 meters or 30 feet. A boat between 35 and 65 feet only drafts around 3 meters. Or 3 feet, I'm sorry, 1 meter. The change will make this mandate, it's going to be the most consequential maritime regulation that the recreational boating fishing sector has ever seen. And I just want to, I want NOAA to, you need to pause implementation of this rule because it's not only going to have an effect on commercial and recreation fishing, but you're going to devastate the maritime industry up and down the entire East Coast. And so I don't know how to express that any plainer to this administration. But NOAA needs to take an extra hard look at what they're about to do to this industry. And with that, I yield back. The chair recognizes Ms. Bonanici for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. The work of NOAA has been so critically important in our home state of Oregon, and as representative for the Oregon's North Coast, I'm very pleased to see that NOAA's budget is increased to expand NOAA's work on what you refer to as climate goods and services. Our constituents benefit and we benefit as policymakers when we have good information and good science about wildfires, floods, drought, extreme heat, coasts, mitigation. There's just a lot that's going to be beneficial in there. Also align myself with the remarks of the Ranking Member Ross on the importance of workforce, particularly with good weather and climate forecasters. And then also thank you for the mention of the blue economy, tremendous economic potential for our coastal communities with the right policy. So Dr. Spinrad, I want to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, both of which I enthusiastically supported. We've seen funding notices for the infrastructure law, and I'm thrilled about the 6 of the projects now are in Oregon and our coastal communities, important infrastructure work there. So we have not seen a spend plan for the Inflation Reduction Act implementation. We expected it a few months back, and we're eager to see more of NOAA's plans, like the Climate Ready Coast Initiative. So I appreciate your work to move forward on these initiatives, but what can I tell my constituents about the timing of the investments and when they'll start to see benefits in their communities?
Yeah, thank you for that, Congresswoman Bonamici. We're also very excited about what we're going to be able to do in terms of climate-ready coasts, coastal resilience, and we're especially delighted to make the announcement. I personally joined the Vice President to announce $561 million worth of investment, including those that you alluded to in Oregon. That is just the first in what I know will be many similar announcements. The Inflation Reduction Act spend plan is moving through the system right now. We've made some final recommendations and specifically wanted to make sure we were attending to needs of underserved communities and tribal communities. And that, of course, required a rigorous consultation process. But I can confidently tell you that it will be up here for consideration very shortly, within a matter of hopefully a couple of weeks to months.
Terrific. That's good news. I appreciate that. So as you're aware, Administrator Spinrad, Oregon's highly vulnerable to tsunami events. I actually remember back in 2011, after the earthquake and tsunami in Japan, we were bracing on the Oregon coast, but we're very concerned about a nearshore tsunami, of course, being on the Cascadia subduction zone. So one of the first bills I worked on when I got to this committee more than a decade ago was the Tsunami Warning Education Research Act. That will really help our coastal communities prepare and update our tsunami warning system. So I'm glad that the fiscal year 24 budget includes an increase to unify the tsunami warning centers under a common analytics system so they can continue to operate smoothly, avoid operational failures, and invest in information technology and information security. So how will these additional steps provide resources to protect our communities and ecosystems from these natural disasters? And the Tsunami Warning Program authorization expires this year. So do you have some suggestions about what we should be considering as we draft legislation to reauthorize the program?
Thank you for that question. Tsunamis are, of course, a looming hazard, and I think if you look at what's happened in the last couple of years, for example, the Hunga-Tonga earthquake or mudslide generated tsunami showed us that we still have a lot to learn with respect to what will generate these earthquakes. And I know I don't need to point out to you that in the state of Oregon, it's the near zone, Cascadia subduction zone threat that means having a tsunami that could hit the state in less than half an hour. Yes.
Right.
So a few thoughts. You alluded to some of them. Technological solutions through improved observation and detection capabilities, including what we call the dark buoys. The next generation dark buoys is one of the things we'll be working on. We're also looking at a coordinated, even more coordination with our colleagues at USGS, because if it's an earthquake generated near zone, how can we use the existing warning systems as much for the near zone generation as we can for the distance generated tsunamis? I would also point out that I want to emphasize the issue you raised with regard to unification of services from the two centers in Alaska and Hawaii. I did visit our Hawaii Center and asked specifically, what do we need to do to make sure that basically for the user communities, they don't care if a warning is coming from one center or the other. We need to make sure that we have a standardized approach and process. So I'm delighted the head of the Weather Service, Ken Graham, has taken this as one of his top priorities.
Terrific. That's encouraging, and I'm about to run out of time, so I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you. At this time, we have no other questions unless y'all have any follow-up that you would like to address the administrator.
Just to thank him for his time.
Thank you.
I know we have a couple of other members that were making their way back over here. We got numerous hearings going on at the same time. But I did have something I wanted to follow up with you. I had a meeting yesterday, and it was with Georgia Tech there in Atlanta. And they were very proud of their weather research that they're doing. And do you tie into Georgia Tech, or is there a similarity between what you two do? Or?
Absolutely. I would say we have a wonderful relationship with the whole academic community. I can't tell you chapter and verse of every project we're working with our colleagues at Georgia Tech, but I know if I went back to the office, we'd get a nice list of the specific activities. We work in our research office, our Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research. We manage our research two ways. One is we have our own laboratories, and that is typically where we do things that we know are going to have to be sustained over many years, and which are directly tied into our operational capabilities. And then we have a funded research program, sponsored research with our academic colleagues, including Georgia Tech, where through competitive grants, not dissimilar to the way the National Science Foundation conducts research, we actually provide grants, contracts, cooperative agreements to do research on areas where we see particular expertise. And so a place like Georgia Tech, for example, has some world-renowned hurricane researchers where they can bring special insight and provide new findings that we can then advance into our operational capability.
Right. So, I mean, and I just wanted to clarify, so there's really no duplication in what NOAA does and maybe what some of these academic universities are doing. It's kind of complementary.
Yeah, in fact, when I was the head of NOAA Research, I instituted a rigorous review process for our research portfolio, including our laboratories, specifically to ensure there was no duplication of effort. We also have a Science Advisory Board, which is a federal advisory committee, which rigorously reviews our research activities to ensure, first of all, we're spending the taxpayers' money in the most appropriate manner, and second of all, that we are not duplicating effort.
Yes, sir. Do you have any idea on what's coming up? And I didn't get to ask that of the Georgia Tech representatives there.
It's specifically at Georgia Tech? I don't know off the top of my head. I do know there is some hurricane research. I don't know if we're currently doing that right now, but we can certainly get back to you with a more specific answer.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that'd be great. I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
The chair would like to recognize Mr. Lucas, who's probably 10 pounds lighter.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, you will find as you work your way through this process, there's lots of exercise you'll get, but that's what makes being a member of this august body so wonderful. Are you recognizing me for 5 minutes, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir. You are recognized
Thank
for 5
you
minutes.
very much. Administrator Spinrad, when you testified on FY22 budget, you said you shared my desire to expand commercial weather data if it meets NOAA standards and sustained availability. And while the FY24 budget requests $6 million increase for commercial data purchases, it also lays out a plan to keep the account at essentially the same level of $25 million every year through FY28. Can you explain the decision? Can you explain this decision just a little bit more to us?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I actually think we're in an extraordinary position right now with respect to the use of commercial data. You may know I have come out of retirement twice now to come back to NOAA, and I previously served as the head of NOAA Research. The idea of using commercial data was not even part of the thinking. So I think the first thing to recognize is that we now have a plan for sustained investment in commercial data. I would also add that, quite honestly, it's a bit of an unknown in two regards, because the private sector is developing new capabilities. And also because we want to make sure it's sustainable. The private sector is going to provide us data, but they need a bottom line of, if you will, of other clients. And so part of the thinking with respect to the long-term investment is, let's stabilize this, let's look at what the power of the investment is, and let's continue to reconsider how it should be balanced.
Can you expand for a moment on the sources on commercial data, number of providers, the new types of data becoming available on the market every year that NOAA could potentially purchase? Just give us a little background.
I can give you a general response with a little bit of insight, and then I'd love to be able to follow up with some very specific response. But I know, for example, one of the areas that's been most powerful and effective is the purchase of what we call GPS radio occultation data, and that we have worked with at least 3 different corporations for the purchase of this data. In short, this is a novel capability the private sector has developed that allows us to collect thousands of profiles of atmospheric data per day using some very creative manipulation of satellite transmission data. Those 3 companies have demonstrated effectiveness in doing that. I believe we just renewed the contract for one of those. But that's an example of what we're doing and how, and oh, by the way, those data feed directly into our numerical weather prediction guidance for our forecasters.
Absolutely. This Congress, I'm leading a major legislative effort to establish NOAA as an independent agency with an Organic Act. And I'm not going to ask you to endorse, I'm not even going to ask you for a comment on the legislation. But I don't want to hide the ball either on the intent behind my question. When putting together NOAA's budget, can you estimate how many meetings or conversations you have with what you would define as your higher-ups in the Department of Commerce?
A lot. And it's interesting you asked that, Chair Lucas, because I do keep a very close look at my calendar in terms of the balance of internal and external engagement, and I can comfortably tell you it is about 50-50. And internal also includes the Department of Commerce, not just my higher-ups, but I would say some of the most productive dialogues I'm having, for example, are with my counterpart at the Patent and Trademark Office, International Trade Administration, Economic Development Administration, and of course NIST and Census. So a lot of cross-decking in the department.
Absolutely. And to continue with my logic, it's public knowledge that Commerce has the capacity to transfer NOAA funding to its working capital fund for shared services, and has done so with millions of dollars. Do you and DOC leadership discuss these potential actions, or better yet, potential dollar amounts when putting together your annual budgets?
We certainly discuss with the department those distributions, yes.
Thank you. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your indulgence on time, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having no other members or seeing no other members, seeing no other members that have any questions, I want to thank the witness for his valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members. With that, this hearing is adjourned.